Your father's funeral is personal. Adrian needs your seat more.
You canceled my flight?
Adrian needs you there.
Ma'am, you just removed the owner of this $18 billion airline.
My wife canceled my seat to my father's funeral while I stood 3 feet away, then handed the boarding pass to the man who had spent 6 months teaching her to look at me like a failed investment. Neither of them noticed the red security banner flashing beside my name on the airline's check-in screen. Lauren slid my passport across the marble counter at North Star Meridian's premium lobby as if she were returning a library card. Behind her, the departure board rolled through flights to London, Tokyo, and Bozeman, the city where my father's casket was waiting. Adrian Vale stood at her shoulder in a charcoal suit, holding the boarding pass for seat 2A. My seat. There wasn't another way, Lauren said, loud enough for 2 agents and everyone in the priority line to hear. Adrian has to reach the restructuring session. Your funeral is personal. His meeting affects thousands of jobs. She knew the next commercial route would reach Montana after the burial. You transferred a ticket issued in my name? I asked. Adrian gave me a practiced look of sympathy. The executive desk made an exception. Lauren explained the circumstances. On the monitor, the red banner vanished before either of them looked down. The humiliation was not about losing business class. I had crossed oceans in cargo jump seats and slept beside tool cabinets while mechanics rebuilt damaged engines. What cut through me was the calm way my wife ranked my grief beneath Adrian's ambition. Lauren had once driven 4 hours through an ice storm after my truck failed near Amarillo. She had sat beside me on a motel floor, eating crackers and laughing because the heater sounded like a dying auxiliary power unit. That woman had not disappeared overnight. I had watched her retreat by inches first when she stopped inviting me to client dinners. Then when she called my students people who work under the real decision-makers. And finally when Adrian began appearing in our kitchen with proposals too sensitive for email. I answered each insult with silence. Silence was the Mercer family's preferred anesthetic, and I had inherited the habit more completely than any legal asset. I can get to Bozeman another way, I said. Lauren's face softened for half a second. Then Adrian checked his watch. We should clear security. The board members flying through Denver won't wait. There was no public notice of a board gathering in Denver. The official succession session was in Dallas, and only 7 people had received its sealed itinerary. I looked at him more carefully. Adrian wore confidence the way experienced pilots wore turbulence without visible effort. Which board members? I asked. Lauren exhaled. Don't do this here. Ethan. She used my name in that clipped tone whenever Adrian was nearby, as though our marriage were an unprofessional interruption. Adrian smiled. People trying to keep this airline alive. I realize that may sound abstract from a training hangar. Lauren glanced toward the priority line, embarrassed not by his contempt but by the possibility that I might answer it. I could have ended the performance with 3 calls. Naomi Pierce could freeze the transfer. Corporate security could detain Adrian for questioning. The trust office could explain why the quiet man in work boots had authority their consultant had spent months trying to undermine. But my father had died 14 hours earlier. And the last thing he had said to me was that power revealed character fastest when a man was wounded. I had dismissed it as another lesson delivered too late. Standing there, I understood why he had chosen those words. Go, I told Lauren. You've made your decision. She searched my face, perhaps waiting for anger she could call unreasonable. I gave her none. Adrian lifted my boarding pass like a private salute and led her through the security entrance beneath North Star Meridian's blue compass. I stayed at the counter until they disappeared behind the frosted glass. The agent whispered, Sir, I'm sorry. The transfer came through executive authorization. Her badge read my-aligned. She was young enough to believe senior authorization always meant legitimate authority. Print the audit receipt, I said. Not the passenger copy. The authorization chain. Her eyes narrowed. Most travelers did not know that record existed. She tapped twice, hesitated, and looked toward the duty manager station. A woman in a Navy uniform stepped from behind a partition. I recognized Rosa Alvarez before she recognized me. 15 years earlier, she had been a night shift mechanic in one of my first turbine classes. brilliant with engines and terrified of meetings. Now she managed the airline's most important terminal operation. Rosa took the printout, scanned the routing code, and looked at my face. Her expression changed into the disciplined stillness of someone realizing the emergency was larger than the room. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Maya glanced between us. Rosa lowered her voice, though not enough to hide the final words from the agents beside her. "Why did the chairman's office just cancel the voting trustees' protected itinerary?" Rosa's question followed me into the private operations room. But the answer had begun years before Lauren ever learned to despise the life we shared. I had chosen maintenance training because machines did not care what family name was printed on a trust document. A turbine either received clean fuel, correct airflow, and honest inspection, or it failed. At 38, I still spent 4 days a week teaching apprentices how to read damage patterns and challenge paperwork that looked too perfect. I was proud of that work. My father called it hiding in a hangar. Graham Mercer believed leadership meant standing where everyone could see you, even when you were wrong. I believed visibility without competence was theater. Our last major argument came after he offered me an executive title before I had supervised a single overnight repair. I refused, and he accused me of using my mother's death as permission to avoid responsibility. He was cruel in the way frightened men sometimes become precise. Yet, he was not entirely wrong. We eventually made an agreement through Naomi. I would remain outside headquarters, learn the airline from the ground up, and retain my succession rights without public announcement. I used my mother's surname professionally and let the Mercer name fade from ordinary conversation. What I did not understand was that secrecy, once rewarded, becomes easier to defend than to end. Lauren met me during an airport shutdown caused by a fuel system contamination scare. She was coordinating emergency lodging for stranded crews, and I was helping mechanics rotate through 18-hour shifts. She did not care that my truck had a cracked dashboard or that my apartment overlooked a tire warehouse. She cared that I remembered every technician's name and stayed until the last aircraft was cleared. For years, we were good together. We cooked badly, argued honestly, and saved for trips we sometimes canceled because one of us had work. When she asked about my father, I said he ran an aviation company and that we were not close. That answer was technically true and morally incomplete. After we married, the omission became a structure I had to keep repairing. Each time Lauren asked why Graham never visited, why Naomi handled strange legal papers, or why airport executives occasionally recognized me, I offered another partial explanation. Later, as Lauren's consulting career moved her into wealthier circles, she began measuring our life against people who displayed success more aggressively. I noticed the changes and treated them as evidence that I had been right to hide the money. I never considered that she might have been reacting not only to status, but to the permanent locked door inside her own marriage. Instead of telling her the truth, I watched her. I tested whether she would remain kind without knowing what I could give her. That was not humility. It was control disguised as caution. The first time Lauren mentioned Adrian Vale, she described him as a client who respected her judgment. Soon his name entered our dinners. Then his messages arrived after midnight, always attached to some urgent proposal or career opportunity. He praised the instincts I had stopped encouraging and framed my quiet life as fear. I responded by becoming even quieter. When Lauren excluded me from a hotel development gala because my shop floor stories would not fit the room, I told myself the marriage would correct itself. When she repeated Adrian's claim that North Star Meridian needed to sell its freight division, I asked how a hospitality consultant had gained access to a confidential strategic debate. She accused me of being threatened by people with ambition. I could have told her that the freight network was protected by the trust I would one day control. Instead, I slept in my office and called that restraint. In Rosa's operations room, Naomi finally stripped away the comfort of that lie. She arrived with a sealed folder and placed 3 pages on the table, consulting invoices, travel records, and a background research request submitted by Adrian's firm. The request was dated 4 months before Lauren said they had met. It included her client list, our home address, my teaching schedule, and a notation identifying her as probable access point to dormant successor. Rosa looked at me without speaking. Naomi did not soften her voice. He did not discover your wife. Ethan, she said. He selected her. Naomi spread Adrian's research across the operations table until my marriage looked less like a relationship than an acquisition file. His firm had purchased consumer profiles, professional network data, property records, and conference attendance lists through 3 research vendors. Most of it was legal. That made it more disturbing. He knew which clients made Lauren feel important, which colleagues had been promoted ahead of her, and how often she searched executive openings in cities where North Star Meridian operated hubs. He also knew when I taught evening classes, when I traveled to Montana, and which weeks Lauren and I spent apart. Rosa pulled the authorization history from my canceled reservation while Naomi showed me an invitation Lauren had received 11 months earlier to moderate a hospitality panel. Vail Strategic Partners had quietly funded the event. Adrian had arranged to sit beside her at dinner, though his name never appeared on the original program. He created the coincidence, I said. Naomi nodded. The files could not tell me whether Lauren had welcomed his attention immediately or resisted it at first. They did show that Adrian's analysts updated her profile after every meeting. One entry described her as increasingly receptive to arguments about suppressed potential and marital asymmetry. I had no right to read her mind, but I could read what he had measured. He had taken every silence I left inside our marriage and converted it into leverage. Daniel Cho joined us through an encrypted video link from North Star Meridian's operations center. He had spent the night tracing the liquidity crisis Adrian used to justify selling the freight network. On paper, the airline had committed nearly $400 million in deposits for 6 leased aircraft intended to replace an aging long-haul fleet. Daniel displayed 2 payment schedules. Each looked ordinary alone. Together, they showed that 3 deposits had been paid twice through different subsidiaries. Martin Kessler, the chief financial officer, had approved the second set under a confidential fleet renewal code. The money then moved through a leasing broker in Delaware and into an Irish holding company whose directors were professional nominees. Naomi had linked that company to a lender financing Adrian's proposed freight acquisition. We cannot call it theft yet, she warned. Not until the independent auditors establish beneficial ownership and intent. Announcing the evidence too early could cause lenders to freeze credit lines and ground aircraft within days. That was why Daniel had kept the discovery inside a restricted safety review. The same aircraft deposits Adrian cited as proof of insolvency might have been designed to create the insolvency. I studied the approval times and felt the old maintenance instinct settle over me. Catastrophic failures rarely began with one dramatic break. They began when several small warnings were explained away by people who benefited from the explanation. The deeper we looked, the more Adrian's knowledge pointed toward someone inside the company. Naomi showed me a draft trust memorandum stating that Graham doubted my emotional fitness to control the airline. The language sounded like my father, formal, sharp, almost allergic to tenderness. Yet the document retention number belonged to a policy adopted 2 months after the date beside his signature. Someone had taken an authentic memorandum and revised it later. Naomi had discovered the mismatch 3 days earlier but had not confronted Martin, whose department controlled the archive migration. A false accusation without a clean chain of custody becomes a gift to opposing counsel, she said when I asked why she had waited. Rosa then recovered a secondary security log from the executive records floor. The main video contained a 17-minute gap described as a system reset. The backup access record showed 2 badges entering the archive during that gap. One belonged to Martin. The other belonged to Caleb, my younger half-brother. I had not spoken to Caleb in 8 months. He blamed me for remaining absent while Graham's health declined, and part of that blame was deserved. Still, resentment did not prove conspiracy. I refused to let anger complete a case the evidence had not finished. Naomi agreed, though her expression told me patience was becoming expensive. Adrian had an internal financial ally, access to trust information, and a carefully cultivated route through my wife. What we still lacked was proof that those pieces served one coordinated plan. That proof began to take shape in the reservation logs. Rosa enlarged the authorization token used to remove me from the Bozeman flight. Lauren had approved the transfer at 7:42 that morning. But the executive exception had been created at 6:18, nearly 90 minutes before she called the airline. The request originated from a travel account assigned to Vail Strategic Partners and referenced a succession itinerary that had not yet been released outside the trust office. Adrian had arranged the solution before presenting Lauren with the problem. He needed my seat. But more importantly, he needed me away from Dallas. Naomi's phone rang before I could ask what waited here. She listened without interruption, then placed the call on speaker. A court clerk confirmed that an emergency petition had been filed to suspend the Mercer Aviation Trust's succession authority until my fitness could be reviewed. The first hearing was scheduled for the following afternoon. Seconds later, another message arrived from North Star Meridian's corporate secretary. Graham's memorial would be held in Montana. But the mandatory succession session had been moved to company headquarters in Dallas that night. Attendance was required in person. Adrian had sent my wife toward Denver, tried to strand me without a flight, and filed to block my authority before my father was even buried. For the first time, I understood that the canceled seat had never been the insult. It was an operational move. By 7 that evening, the top floor of North Star Meridian's headquarters had become part memorial, part tribunal. Graham's photograph stood beside the boardroom doors, but no one stopped long enough to mourn him. Naomi had issued a formal succession notice to every director, trustee beneficiary, and executive named in the governing documents. Adrian never reached Denver. He abandoned the flight after receiving the notice and arrived with Lauren less than 20 minutes before the meeting, both of them still carrying airport bags. Lauren looked at me across the lobby as if I had followed her into a world where I did not belong. Caleb stood beside her, pale and restless, while Martin Kessler whispered to 2 directors near the windows. Inside, Naomi placed a black binder before each seat and asked the corporate secretary to record everyone present. She did not introduce me dramatically. She read the trust certificate, the share register, and Graham's death verification in the same controlled voice she used for any legal fact. Then she stated that the Mercer Aviation Trust held 52% of North Star Meridian's voting shares, and that, upon Graham's death, its voting authority transferred to the designated successor trustee. Every face turned toward me before she said my name. Lauren's hand closed around the back of her chair. Adrian did not look surprised enough. The documents gave me the right to vote the trust's shares, nominate 4 of 9 directors, and block any sale of the freight network, maintenance campuses, or protected airport slots. They did not make me an unchecked monarch. Graham had required an independent fitness certification within 10 days of succession, and until that review was complete, any major transaction I proposed needed audit committee approval. Caleb retained a substantial economic interest through a separate family trust, but no direct voting power. His jaw tightened when Naomi explained that distinction. Celeste Ward asked the questions a responsible director should have asked: why I had never attended a board meeting, what experience qualified me to oversee an international carrier, and whether my concealment created governance risk. I answered without hiding behind my surname. I told her about 15 years in maintenance training, accident prevention work, and the operational reports I had quietly submitted to Graham. I also admitted that refusing visibility had consequences. Daniel confirmed my technical record but stopped short of endorsing me as chairman. Competence in a hangar is evidence, he said, not a complete succession plan. I respected him more for saying it. Adrian finally spoke, framing the trust structure as an outdated family mechanism threatening employees and lenders. He never attacked my wealth. He attacked my readiness, which was smarter because part of his argument was true. Lauren waited until the directors recessed, then pulled me into the adjoining conference room. Adrian remained outside the glass wall. 9 years, she said. I spent 9 years defending our limits while you watched me believe they were real. She listed the apartment we kept, the offers she declined because relocation seemed impossible, and every time I let her feel ashamed for wanting more. I told her the fortune had never entitled either of us to a different life without agreement. She answered that the point was not money. The point was that I had made myself the only person allowed to understand our choices. That accusation landed because it was accurate. I had not caused her to give away my funeral seat or share private information with Adrian. Those were her decisions. But I had built a marriage in which truth arrived only when I controlled the timing. I was afraid you would love the name instead of me. I said, "So you decided I didn't deserve the chance to know you?" She replied. I could not argue. When I asked whether she and Adrian were having an affair, she looked toward the glass and said their relationship was not what I thought. It was not an answer, and I no longer trusted myself to fill the silence. The recess ended with Naomi holding the memorandum, claiming Graham doubted my emotional fitness. Adrian's attorneys had attached it to an emergency petition supported by affidavits from Lauren, Caleb, and Martin. Lauren described my secrecy and withdrawal. Caleb claimed Graham intended to replace me. Martin warned that lenders would treat my succession as instability. Adrian urged the board to approve the freight sale before the dispute damaged the airline further. Naomi objected that the memorandum's retention code suggested alteration. But the court had not ruled on authenticity. Then Celeste received a message from outside counsel and read it twice. A judge had issued a temporary order preserving the status quo until the next afternoon's hearing. I could vote on routine matters, but I could not replace directors, remove officers, block the pending sale process, or access certain executive systems without approval. Martin closed his binder with visible relief. Adrian looked directly at me for the first time that night. He had not taken the company, but he had taken the hours in which I might have stopped him. The board scheduled its final vote on the freight proposal for immediately after the hearing. By sunrise, my face was on every business channel in the country. The headlines called me the hidden heir, the mechanic prince, and, in one especially creative segment, the billionaire who deceived his own wife. None of them mentioned that the trust's valuation was not money sitting in my account or that most of North Star Meridian's worth existed in aircraft, contracts, debt, and the work of 46,000 employees. The airline's lenders demanded a succession plan before noon. 2 unions requested emergency assurances that the freight sale would not be followed by layoffs. Reservations dropped sharply after an anonymous source claimed I intended to privatize the company and remove experienced management. The temporary court order prevented me from correcting that lie with internal data. Martin used the confusion to circulate Adrian's proposal, which promised immediate cash, reduced debt, and operational focus. It also assumed that the passenger airline could survive without the maintenance facilities and cargo contracts that supported it during weak travel seasons. Celeste told me 3 directors who had opposed the sale were reconsidering. Their fear was not irrational. Aircraft needed fuel regardless of who deserved control. Daniel met me outside the operations center and said, "People here do not need a Mercer family argument. They need to know whether payroll clears Friday." I had no comforting answer. For the first time since Rosa recognized me at the terminal, inherited authority felt less like power than a fire I had been handed without gloves. Lauren's interview aired at 10. She sat in a neutral hotel suite with no visible lawyer beside her and described herself as a woman discovering that her entire marriage had been built around concealed wealth and secret obligations. She did not accuse me of violence, theft, or infidelity. She did something more effective. She told the parts of the truth that made the rest easy to imagine. She said I disappeared for nights without explaining where I went, allowed her to make career sacrifices based on false financial limits, and treated questions about my family as disloyalty. Each statement hurt because I could identify the memory behind it. Then the interviewer asked about Adrian. Lauren said he was a professional advisor who had believed in her when I had not. She did not mention that his firm had profiled her before they met or that he had arranged the cancellation of my funeral flight. Naomi advised me not to respond publicly until the hearing. Silence is helping them. I said, "Undisciplined truth will help them more." She answered. By noon, the board's independent directors asked whether I would voluntarily step aside for 6 months while a neutral trustee managed the company. I almost agreed. Surrendering could end the spectacle. Protect the share price. and free Lauren from further public attention. It would also leave Adrian's sale process intact. I sat alone in Graham's former office. Looking at a resignation draft, Naomi had prepared only because I ordered her to. Signing it would have felt like sacrifice. That made me suspicious of how badly I wanted to do it. The office held almost nothing personal. Graham had believed photographs softened executive judgment. Though he secretly kept one of my mother inside a locked drawer, I found it beneath an old flight manual along with a digital recorder marked for me in Naomi's handwriting. She had discovered it in his estate box that morning but refused to describe it as a final answer. "Your father left guidance," she said. "Not prophecy." His voice came through weak and uneven. He admitted that he had built the trust to protect the airline from raiders but had also used control to avoid apologizing, listening, and changing. He said he had mistaken my distance for ingratitude because that was easier than admitting he had made closeness dangerous. Then he addressed the succession. He did not name Adrian, Martin, or any conspiracy. Instead, he warned that someone would eventually force me to choose between defending the company and defending my pride. "The shares can make people obey you," he said, "but obedience is not the same thing as trust. If you use the airline to settle a private wound, you will preserve my company and repeat my worst mistake." The recording ended without sentiment. I listened twice. Graham had not cleared me of my failures. He had removed my last excuse for repeating them. I tore the resignation draft in half, then called Naomi, Daniel, and Celeste. I would submit to the independent fitness examination, disclose my hidden identity and marital deception under oath, and place my director appointments in escrow until the evidence was reviewed. In exchange, I wanted an audit presented before any asset vote. Naomi warned that voluntary disclosure would give Adrian's lawyers material they could use against me. "Then they will use the truth," I said, "not the version they manufactured." Daniel agreed to prepare a stabilization plan showing how the airline could meet payroll and preserve lender covenants without selling the freight division. Celeste secured court permission for the audit committee to examine the duplicate deposits, provided the review remained independent of my control. Rosa preserved the reservation system logs under a formal legal hold. By evening, a forensic vendor had recovered part of the missing security backup, and Naomi confirmed that the altered fitness memorandum had passed through Martin's credentials after Graham's signature. None of it was yet enough. We had fragments, not a case. And Adrian still had a contingency none of us could identify. Lauren sent me one message before midnight. "Was any part of our life real to you?" I typed 3 answers and deleted all of them. The hearing was not the place to repair a marriage, and power was not a tool for earning forgiveness. I finally replied that what I had felt was real. What I had concealed was wrong, and neither truth erased what she had chosen. Then I turned off my phone. At 9 the next morning, the court would review my fitness. At 11, the board would vote on the freight sale. Between those 2 decisions, Adrian Vale intended to take the airline apart. I intended to show everyone exactly how he had built the crisis, starting with a single authorization issued while its supposed signer was 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. I began the hearing by giving Adrian the truth he expected me to hide. The federal courtroom had become a hybrid session, with the judge on the bench, North Star Meridian's directors at one table, trust counsel at another, and a secure video wall carrying shareholders and lenders. Lauren sat behind Adrian's attorneys. I could not tell whether she was his witness or simply had nowhere else to sit. Under oath, I admitted that I had concealed my identity from my wife, allowed her to make decisions without understanding my family obligations, and avoided leadership because I feared becoming my father. I said none of that made her betrayal imaginary, and none of her choices erased mine. Then I turned to the board. "You should not restore my authority because of my name," I said. "Restore it only if the evidence shows the crisis was engineered and if the replacement plan can keep our aircraft flying." Adrian's counsel called my statement an emotional performance. Adrian remained composed as Martin presented the lease deposits as legitimate emergency commitments. On the screen, 6 payments appeared in a clean sequence. I asked Martin who had approved the 4th. He pointed to his digital signature. I did. He said, at no, Scheissbrezeke, M. On March 3, Daniel slid one maintenance record to the clerk. At Noah, Scheissbrezeke, M. Martin had been aboard Flight 88 over the Atlantic, and that aircraft's satellite data system had been disabled for scheduled repair. It was a small contradiction, not proof of theft, but Martin reacted as though I had accused him of murder. He insisted the authorization must have synchronized after landing, then changed his explanation and said his deputy had used delegated credentials. Naomi asked him to identify the deputy. He could not. Celeste requested the original authentication log from the independent forensic vendor. The record showed that Martin's token had been used inside North Star Meridian's executive finance suite while his phone and security badge were both in the air. A second log placed Director Leonard Pike, who had publicly described himself as neutral, in the same suite that night. Pike claimed he had attended an unrelated compensation meeting. Celeste opened a calendar export recovered under subpoena. No such meeting existed. What did exist was a draft agreement from Vail Strategic Partners promising Pike a paid advisory position after the freight sale. The room changed by degrees. Directors who had avoided looking at me began reading the exhibits. Lender representatives muted private calls and leaned closer to their screens. Adrian did not lose control. He said unauthorized credential use proved internal weakness, not his involvement. That was the answer of a man who had prepared for the first breach. I had spent my career teaching mechanics not to stop at the first damaged component. Then let's follow the system, I said. The second layer came from records no single person controlled. Rosa authenticated the reservation token created before Lauren requested my cancellation. The token originated from Adrian's corporate travel account and contained the sealed succession itinerary. The forensic vendor matched its encryption certificate to the same server that received the duplicate aircraft deposits. Naomi then presented the original fitness memorandum from the trust's offline archive. Graham's signed version criticized my absence but did not question my legal capacity. The paragraph supporting suspension had been inserted later through Martin's administrator credentials. Restored security backups showed Martin and Caleb entering the records floor during the missing 17 minutes, while a door sensor confirmed that Pike admitted them after hours. Caleb's attorney immediately asked for a recess. Caleb refused. From the gallery, he said Adrian had promised him a voting seat if he helped prove I had abandoned the family. He admitted copying files, but claimed he never knew the deposits were false. I believed the first part was possible, but belief was no longer the standard. Naomi displayed the financial chain. North Star funds moved through the leasing broker, into the Irish holding company, and then to a lender whose controlling beneficiary was a Vail-managed acquisition vehicle. The manufactured shortage had financed the consortium preparing to buy the assets at a discount. Adrian called the structure lawful. Celeste answered before I could. Not when a fiduciary creates the emergency he is paid to solve. The final evidence did not concern aircraft or shares. It concerned Lauren. Naomi warned the court that the material included private communications and asked permission to limit the record to what established Adrian's intent. The judge agreed. I was grateful because I had no desire to turn my marriage into public entertainment. An internal Vail strategy deck appeared on the screen, dated 4 months before Adrian met Lauren. Her photograph sat beneath the heading, Access Channel, Domestic Successor Exposure. The slides tracked her career frustrations, my schedule, and the likelihood that marital conflict could support a fitness petition. Another document listed the funeral flight as a separation event, designed to keep me away from the succession session and provoke a reaction that could be recorded. Lauren made a sound behind me, sharp enough to hear across the room. Adrian told her the language belonged to junior analysts and did not reflect his feelings. Naomi opened one final email he had sent to the acquisition lender, once spousal testimony is secured. Remove L. M. from communications. No continuing role post-close. Lauren stood so quickly her chair struck the wall. She did not come toward me. She looked at Adrian and asked whether any job he promised her had existed. He answered that she was allowing humiliation to distort a sophisticated transaction. That was when she handed her phone to the marshal and said it contained messages Adrian had instructed her to delete. Adrian's composure broke. He warned the lenders that exposing the deposit structure would trigger cross-default clauses and ground the airline within 72 hours. It was his contingency, even if he lost the sale. He intended to make resistance look suicidal. Daniel presented the plan we had built overnight. The unavailable reserves were not gone. The court could freeze the shell company accounts while North Star Meridian used a bridge facility backed by freight receivables, maintenance contracts, and temporary concessions approved by union leaders. Celeste confirmed the audit committee had reviewed the numbers without my involvement. 3 lenders agreed on the record to maintain credit if the disputed executives were removed and independent oversight installed. The judge dissolved the restrictions on the trust, preserved the evidence, and referred the suspected fraud, data theft, and fiduciary breaches to federal regulators. The board rejected the freight sale, suspended Martin and Pike, and accepted Caleb's removal from company facilities pending investigation. With my voting authority restored, I did not appoint loyalists. I nominated 2 independent directors and placed my chairmanship under a 1-year performance review. Lauren passed me in the corridor after the hearing. Her eyes were swollen, but she did not ask for forgiveness, and I did not offer reunion. He used me, she said. Yes, I answered, and I still chose what I did. For the first time in months, we agreed on the same truth. Outside, North Star Meridian aircraft continued lifting from the runway, not because I had inherited them, but because enough people had chosen evidence over fear. 18 months after the hearing, North Star Meridian no longer appeared in the news because of my marriage. That was the first sign we had begun to recover. The airline completed an independent governance review, added 2 directors with no Mercer connections, and separated the roles of trust, representative, and board chair. I remained voting trustee, but Celeste chaired the board while my performance was reviewed against safety, labor, and financial targets available to every director. Daniel's stabilization plan kept the fleet operating, and the recovered deposits reduced our debt once the shell company accounts were frozen. Martin pleaded guilty to wire fraud and falsifying corporate records. Pike settled the civil claims and accepted a permanent bar from serving as an officer of a public company. Adrian continued fighting the charges, but his restructuring firm collapsed after clients learned he had manufactured the crisis he was hired to solve. Caleb cooperated with investigators and avoided prison, though he surrendered his company access and any future governance claim. I did not ask the board to punish anyone beyond what the evidence and law required. Restraint did not make the damage smaller. It simply prevented me from adding my anger to it. Lauren and I finalized our divorce without a courtroom spectacle. Our prenuptial agreement kept the trust outside the marital estate, but I agreed to a fair division of the life we had actually built together. She gave regulators the messages Adrian had ordered her to delete and accepted responsibility for the false assumptions in her affidavit. Cooperation did not erase her choices, and remorse did not restore the marriage. We met once after signing the final papers at a quiet restaurant near the airport. She told me she had spent months deciding whether Adrian had changed her or merely discovered what she was willing to become. I said I had asked myself a similar question about secrecy. I had hidden behind the belief that money corrupted people, when my own fear had already distorted the way I loved them. We did not forgive each other in a single conversation. We did not promise friendship. We left with a clearer truth than the one we had carried into marriage. And sometimes that is the most honest ending 2 people can offer. Lauren later joined a regional nonprofit that developed workforce housing. I heard she was doing good work. I never used the airline to check. I still taught 1 maintenance class every month. At first, the students treated me differently after learning my name. So I began each course by placing a damaged turbine blade on the desk and asking whether ownership could make the crack disappear. It never could. That lesson became the foundation of the Mercer Technical Access Program, which funded training for mechanics, dispatchers, avionics specialists, and ground crews who could not afford certification. We built its first center inside the same terminal where Lauren had canceled my flight. The old premium lobby was redesigned with public classrooms, interview booths, and a glass-walled workshop overlooking the taxiways. On opening morning, Rosa handed me a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. I gave them to a 19-year-old apprentice named Luis, whose mother had cleaned aircraft cabins on the night shift for 12 years. He cut the ribbon while his family cheered. Behind him, the glass door that had once separated me from my wife's departure stood open. Travelers moved past it toward their gates, and students moved through it toward work they had been told was beyond them. I watched a North Star Meridian jet rise into the morning sky and thought about the seat I had lost, the name I had buried, and the company I had nearly inherited without deserving. The door remained open after the ceremony. That mattered more to me than who held the key.